Extracted and I made crude. I made a CBD tincture. So I at one point I was kind of like in all these different parts of the business at the same time. And then as things have moved on and progressed, I've gotten out of farming, I've gotten out of product manufacturing, and now I just basically take the hemp, process it, make super clean CBD ingredients for other companies to make their products. However, in this kind of space, I've done a ton of trial and error and experimenting, so I picked up all sorts of stuff. So a part of this is I'm just going to go over through kind of the process of how CBD comes into existence from the perspective of if I was a buyer of a CBD product, what are the things about that I would really, really want to know? And then from there, I'll just go into kind of an open Q&A, and you guys can ask whatever questions you have, and I'll tell you what I know and what I don't know, and hopefully I'll have some useful stuff. So when you're getting a product and it's a CBD isolate, obviously that starts all the way back with hemp. Now raise your hand if you use distillates. Do you use any kind of distillates isolate? Do you use some isolates? Okay. So one thing that's kind of interesting about isolate, and that's our kind of number one product, we make super pure isolate. When you get an isolate, frankly, it almost doesn't matter what came before. We go through extensive purification, so you have a bag full of CBD molecules. When you get into distillate products, which we make distillate first, and I'll kind of take you back through. So hemp, when it comes to me, first I make a crude oil, and then I make a distillate, and then I make a crystallized CBD product. Some people like to use that kind of a distillate product, which has a little bit more taste, and that's something they have to work with. It has some of the other cannabinoids. So as a buyer, when you're looking at a COA, some people are really, really looking at pesticides. That's something that when you are creating a CBD distillate, you concentrate a lot of those things. So that's why you'll see in a full panel those kind of pesticides search for and look for. Once I take that distillate and I put it to the next step and I actually crystallize it, there is no, if I do my job properly crystallizing, there's no pesticides left, even if the distillate was full of pesticides. At this point, with the different, we have filtration methods that we push the pure CBD in a liquid form through that pick up things, and then we crystallize it. So from our current CBD plant in operation, we've never had something ever fail for pesticides. That said, my customers still spend thousands of dollars searching for it, and maybe they should. But in general, if somebody did a great job of making a distillate product, it's not uncommon to see a pesticide in there. I can give you an example. There's a farm, a hemp farm that I worked with, and they're awesome farmers. They make a beautiful, beautiful flower. Their flower all tested out really, really well. And then it had no pesticides or anything else. So then we take it and we make a highly concentrated distillate product from it. And that distillate had a pesticide that has actually been illegal for 25 years. And we went back and what we found out is decades ago, there was apple orchards in that area, and that was a very commonly used pesticide. And so hemp will pull those things out of the ground, and it's an oil-soluble pesticide. And so even though you can't detect it in the flower or the hemp itself, when you take and you strip out all of those oils and you concentrate them, then you make that tiny amount of pesticide 100 times more potent. And that just put it enough to make a blip. So if you're buying isolates in general, most people as a part of their SOP look for pesticides, but you should never find them. If you are using a distillate product, then you may find them, and that's not like a, it may not show up in the hemp, but it may show up in the distillate. So that's just one kind of interesting thing to know. And then from there, there's types of remediations, but from like our perspective as like a company making a commercial product, the only way that we're able to actually clean that is from that stage we crystallize it, and that's where we get that separation. So when you get to, if we go all the way back now to like the farm itself, I'm just going to give you kind of a little bit of a primer on how most hemp that makes it into a CBD distillate or isolate, comes into being. So you have a specific strain of hemp and a specialized seed that is grown to produce big, heavy flowers. So it's not like the old school tall shoots of rope hemp. It's a plant that is completely, similar to the short, squatty marijuana bush plant, not like a long, stringy, tall bamboo like hemp. So there's specialized seeds, and those seeds, industrial hemp is really just a legal definition of any of those plants that are under that 0.3%. And if they hit that number, then they qualify. And as long as they're done under a program that's registered, then it's all a part of that whole grouping. So the farmers will grow that product. And when we get into, the buying of hemp and people look at that, I think one of the most interesting challenges in this is people have a hemp crop and they'll have it tested by the state. The state will come out and they'll take parts of the flower and they'll say they'll say it has 10% CBD and 0.2% THC, so it's compliant. And then at some point, somebody will show up to maybe buy that hemp, and they'll get it, and they'll maybe take it back to their factory, and they have that COA, and now they have these 300-pound bags of hemp, and maybe they've done their numbers on it, and they say, okay, we're going to get this much CBD distillate out of it. Well, the test that the state takes at one point in time really does not match the percentage of CBD that's in every single bag of hemp after it has gone through so much cultivation work. So if that, in my experience, if that COA says 10% hemp CBD content, then the bag of flower I receive will have somewhere between 2% and 5%. So when it comes to hemp and hemp purchasing and that material, there's this problem that farmers have, which is hemp has become extremely competitive. When I first grew hemp, and I grew 12 acres, and I made an incredibly large amount of money. I didn't make it because I was some genius. I was actually probably like a total idiot, and a lot of people thought I was like really stupid to grow that much hemp. They were like, what are you gonna do with that much hemp? And I didn't even have like a straight answer on what I was gonna do with it. But so it's like some combination of luck, and then years ago, guys like me are going around to, the next year I went around and I was just buying everybody's hemp for whatever I had to pay for it as fast as I could get it, and I'm going to conferences telling people how much I'm paying, and then the next year, I go back to the same farms, and a farmer that I bought all of his hemp for this crazy high price, saved his whole farm, more money he's ever made in a year. That guy who grew 8 acres of hemp, he grew 140 this year. And a guy who grew 20 acres grew 100. And a guy who grew, and then all of a sudden, like, I start to see this other pattern emerge, which is, there's a few people telling these stories about what they're putting out there. So that has caused there's just this overproduction. So there's more sort of hemp than can be processed. So in that, generally, if you're a buyer, some buyers want to see a full chain of custody. They want to see the original hemp that was used. They want to see COAs from that. Then from there, they want to, see COAs of products and all that. The COA of the hemp that you're getting oftentimes is a snapshot in time that is a really weak representation of what the processor actually got to work with. They have there was no mold in it. Now there's tons of mold in it. And you take a product that's in a field growing and you have a test result. You have that product 6 months later when it's been sitting in bags and barns. You have different stuff show up. Now from the perspective of our business, as I've been trying to kind of just focus, because I was doing everything and now we're focusing, what I found is the cleanest products that I can make are to basically go through and just make these isolate products where we isolate it and then we can clean everything. And then we end up with CBD and CBD Isolate. And then when people want to make a broad spectrum product, then what we supply is to companies, and they'll take those minor cannabinoids and mix them back in. And that's one way to make a broad spectrum product. And I've had people tell me that is not a true broad spectrum product. And they may be right, but I only explained the reason that people, at least a lot of the larger brands, have gone towards combining purified cannabinoids versus getting distillate is another problem that ends up when you're looking to buy distillate for a product. Oh, go ahead. Yeah. So the difference between a distillate and a broad spectrum, I'll kind of give an overview on my idea of this. There's no technical, for most things, there's no technical definitions in our industry. So the definition that I feel good about is you have full spectrum. And a full spectrum product means it contains everything that's found in the natural distillation process. So that would be, in my opinion, a full spectrum. Some variants of that are, some people remediate the THC in that distillate to be below 0.3. So some people say it's only full spectrum if you distilled it and you didn't do anything else. Some people say it's still full spectrum as long as there's some THC left. So that's one, distinction. And then when you get to broad spectrum generally means that it has, very little THC. So non-detect on a normal test. And then it has other cannabinoids in there. I've seen broad spectrum is commonly applied to as little as 2 cannabinoids. So to go a little bit deeper into the issue of making a broad spectrum product, there's 2 things I think to consider. One of them is if I make a broad spectrum distillate, let's say, and I remediate the THC and you make a product with that, usually what will happen is your product that you make, let's say you make a 5 or a 25 milligram CBD gummy, that's broad spectrum. You'll have 25 milligrams of CBD when you have that gummy tested. You'll have 0 CBG, 0 CBN, 0. It's in there in some amount, but you've now made a product that doesn't test with any measurable amount of those cannabinoids. So one of the reasons that people will go to mixing a broad spectrum product is because that way they can actually print a label and it says 25 milligrams of CBD, 5 milligrams of CBG, and 2 milligrams of CBN. And that's probably one of the most attractive things of the broad spectrum mixes. And for my larger, the larger customers that I work with, they have other issues that we end up learning about years ago, along the way. So when we make a distillate, a broad spectrum distillate, they can only pick one number. Like they need the CBD to be over 80%. Okay, great. But today there's 2% CBD or CBC. There's 1% CBG. There's 0.25% CBN. Tomorrow I get different hemp. It's like even in two sides of the field, the other minor cannabinoids are super random. So company will end up with a broad spectrum product that is never the same. On top of that, they end up with a broad spectrum product that has different flow rates. So when you actually create a distillate and the only thing I'm adjusting is the CBD is 80% and the 20% is other natural like lipids and oils and ingredients in there, if that other 20% is not defined right, it can actually flow at a different rate through automated equipment. And then you end up with this dosing issue. So where I've been pushed is to create these mixes. So basically I can deliver something that's like, 90% CBD exactly, not just some random amount over. And then also will contain a certain amount of CBG, a certain amount of CBN. So those are kind of the pluses and minuses. And I've heard arguments about, the entourage effect. And, what I will say is there may be benefits to the entourage effect, but most all the medical research has also been done on isolates. They seem to do good things for people also. So that's a little bit about the cannabinoids and broad spectrum. Now, as a cannabinoid buyer, one of the huge things we get into is testing and how that testing functions in the real world. So I have some slides. This is Catherine. She's the smartest person in my company. If you wanna. Okay, so we have some tests, and I'll go over here. I don't have all this memorized, but with with a regular test, are you guys familiar with HPLC testing? Do you know what that is? You get different kinds of testing out there. With an HPLC test, they take a little sample of the product, and they mix it with some methanol. They load it onto a tray with maybe 40 other samples. They push all 40 samples through the same little columns of sand, and they measure color changes. It's a really cool system. What most people don't know, and this is what I learned, when it comes to testing, the instrument really matters very little. So the first HPLC I got was $120,000, and I never got it working properly with an accurate reading. I currently have a Shimatsu, which is one of the cheap, they're right over there, I shouldn't call it cheap, one of the most cost-effective HPLC units out there, and it works really awesome because I learned Catherine and also Bonnie, but the operator, and I've tried to solve problems with money many times, and rarely does that work. You can't just buy better equipment because you have to prep the sample, and if you get one of those dilutions off by 100th, these numbers go crazy, to the point where once I understand what they have to do, or I don't feel like I could do it. So what the reason I try to explain that is when people are buying CBD or they're looking at COAs, they see some things sometimes and they're angry at the lab when they shouldn't be, but sometimes they're not angry at the lab when they should be. So I'll try to give you an idea, because these people charge a lot of money to do your testing. And sometimes they do crazy stuff. So let me tell you about some things that look crazy, but actually are not. One of them is, have you guys seen a CBD COA come back at over 100% CBD? Okay. So, yeah. So anytime you see that, basically what's happened is the laws of physics have broken, and there's no. Yeah. So what happens, you see, when you get the COA, you see these lists of numbers. But when the machine is done, you get like this graph. And then a human being looks at it and makes brilliant determinations based on what they see in the graph. They have to click things and tell the machine what that means. So you take a process and like there's a huge amount of human interaction in there. And then based on their best determination, the machine, and I really wish they didn't do this, but the machine gives you a really exact number based on the combination of these things. But HPLC results are only accurate within a range of about 2%. So if it says 102%, that's totally fine. You might have a super pure product. If you made any kind of an error, it's very easy to be another 2% off. So 4%, and that 4% is 4% up, 4% down. Now, where I learned about how bad that can work against you was when I was originally out buying hemp, and I'm spending millions of dollars buying hemp, and I actually got like, to the point where I realized, okay, I can't just take their COA that they got 3 months ago. I need to actually test their hemp as it sits now. So, and we should test a couple bags too, just to make sure. So we get like 2 or 3 tests from their hemp as it sits. And if I'm buying like $1 million worth of hemp, the normal error range that's in here all the time, if they do a good job, could cause me to make or lose like an extra $200,000 on that transaction. It's a huge swing. So then we started doing like 100 tests for potency. And I don't know, I didn't go to college and learn how it works. Basically, you take a lot of tests and it takes the error range and it makes it less. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So we try to get a broad range of samples, because even within that super sack, you've got a mixture of, the best buds, leaves, stems. We've gotten roots in super sacks, and you're just dealing with a really large variability in the product. And so by taking a large number of samples, we can get an average which is much more accurate, and it also helps with what is called accepted method variability. So when you're testing, and Ryan's talking about this range, that's considered completely acceptable. Most labs have an acceptable method variability of 20%, meaning that if their standard varies, if the area of their standard peak varies within a range of 20%, the results are still valid. But that's what then extrapolates into your final results, having an acceptable range of answers. So we've had high purity isolates come back at 103%. I initiate an investigation with the lab because I say, this isn't really acceptable. It's almost 104%. And they come back and they say, oh, no, that's acceptable. So meaning that even if I sent them perfectly pure sample, the real range that they're reporting, when they tell me 103, it means that they would accept an answer from 96% to 104%. And that's a big range when we have buyers that will reject product that comes back with a COA of 97%. So that there's a lot at play with the certificates of analysis.
Yeah. It's really easy in this setting. It's a lot harder to explain to somebody who just started like a month ago as the quality person that has a whole job on the basis of like rejecting our product. And I've like explained to them like, we'll have it tested again. It still might be just fine. Or just send it back and we'll exchange it, but the next batch won't necessarily be better. Now that'll bring us to a couple things that I learned when validating product that was actually super powerful, saves us a lot of money, and it helps us make the best, the best product very quickly.
Do you want to? So a really quick in-house method that we've been using to analyze isolates, it comes from the pharmaceutical industry. They actually measure the color of their pure product when it comes out of production, and it's called the Hazen scale. And it measures the color on a spectrum of kind of yellow values. And you can see some of those minor impurities. They show up in the measurement of the color of the isolate when it's melted. And it's turned out to be a very reliable and accurate way of screening our isolates and looking at the quality of them when they come out of production.
So basically, this is CBD Isolate, 3 different batches. I remember when I was in like kindergarten, the teacher had us all go outside and get snow and put it in a cup, and you watch, and then you see it, like how it melts and how dirty it is, just to teach you not to eat snow. That's kind of what this made me think of. So you have these like 3 different batches of CBD, and then when you melt them, you see this, which I don't know how obvious it is. I'll just take it around. So this one that is the clearest, this one we cheat. We spend like a ton of money and effort to make this super pure. But this is what CBD isolate looks like when it's actually like 99.9% pure. COA isn't a reliable indicator, but you can just melt it because CBD is clear like water. It does not have color. This is also really good product. Like if you melt it and you see it, there's nothing wrong with that. This product is about 98% pure. The yellow in there is not CBD, but it's other things that naturally exist within the plant that just were not cleaned out during the crystallization. So I have little bits of CBDV, some like slightly burnt lipids and some small amount. The other thing actually is when you have isolate, if it is something that is like a very low quality, it can be white like this. It will also have a strong smell. And it won't lean towards like a floral smell. And I'll say the significance of this has been pretty great because when it comes to quality testing batches, that was like a whole thing. You make a batch and then you clear out your equipment, and then you take that you take that and you set it aside for an entire week. You get it tested, and then you see how it goes, and then you release a batch. We still do some of that. The thing is what do you do if you fail it? Then you have to load all that back into the equipment. Our equipment, like our process is super automated. So if I fail a batch, I can melt it right where it sits and run it through the crystallization process because it's totally a closed loop thing. So for us, what we do now is we can take a sample. And it's not just a visual. They make equipment, but this equipment is like $3,500.
Yeah,
So she loads a cartridge. She gets a Hazen color scale, which is what pharmaceutical companies do to determine this quality level anywhere. Because we didn't invent it. I thought I invented it when we did it in the beginning, but anyway. So that's one way to basically just determine the purity very quickly. And so far, we have never been wrong on our third-party stuff. If it fails that, then we just send it back in, and that is dead on. Whereas we have sent in super isolate that melts like clear as water and gotten low results before. I've sent in regular CBD that's come back with 7% THC before. And when those things come back as a buyer, if you see something that comes back and it doesn't make sense, then you can ask your lab to retest it and it will probably just go away because it probably was never there. And at the beginning of this, I was talking about the lab and the samples. If a lab wants to, we have our own R&D lab. So sometimes we run 3 or 4 samples. But if my business was to make money running samples, I would always make sure to have a full tray of 40 loaded samples that run in sequence through the same media, one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. But if you see something in your sample, that doesn't belong there, usually it's carryover. And so what they'll do is when they run your sample the next time, they'll do it as an independent, what do they call it, injection or?
Right. To prevent carryover, you can run blanks between injections, but that's not standard practice at high throughput analytical labs. So they will do that for you if you have questions about your testing or they're performing retesting, but usually the initial results are all run as part of a full analytical run.
Cool.
The other really great thing that I just want to point out with the PowerPoint too and about the melt test is on the bottom, I actually have a picture of 3 isolate samples. You can see the powder. It all looks very similar. The samples shown are melted from those same powdered isolates. When you melt it, there's a huge color difference. Just, that one's a pretty significant difference, but you don't see it when it's powdered because the problem with color is that we know that color changes based on particle size. So the finer that you grind your isolate, the nicer it will look. And you can disguise that by having a very fine grind. It will look more white the more that you grind it. So if you melt it, you can get down to the actual color of the isolate itself as it is without particle size influencing that color. If I go back up, you can see also here, we've got the same isolate. And when it's ground, you can see that it's yellow when it's crystallized in bulk, but as soon as you grind it, it's a beautiful white powder. It looks wonderful, but you can disguise a lot with grinding.
Yeah, when you make stuff fluffy, you can't really tell if you make fine enough crystals. So that's most of what I had to cover. What kind of questions do you guys have about CBD? We make CBG, CBD, CBN. So CBN is kind of an interesting one we make through synthesis. Mm-hmm. Sure. So as far as the manufacturing of, CBD and CBG are both grown naturally in the plant. CBN is a cannabinoid that occurs when CBD or THC degrades over time with heat, with oxygen. So one thing that's done to make CBN right now, years ago, I used to sell CBN for $90,000 a kilo. And it was very hard to make because to separate it, naturally in an acre of hemp, you might have 100 kilos of CBD and 2 grams of CBN. So we're talking about a massive issue. Now, within the last few years, the prices have come way down, the demand has gone way up, and it's almost all done through synthesis, which synthesis is done in a lot of pharmaceutical products. And it's just a fancy way of saying you basically smash the molecules, change them into other stuff, and then you try to separate out all the nasty stuff that isn't what you want. Mm-hmm. The path that it takes to get to CBN is basically you have delta 8. That is the first step. And then from there, transition into CBN. There's other methods probably out there, but in general, you take that and you end up with a mixture that's about 60% CBN and about 40% other mystery compounds. And then from there, what's nice is you can kind of distill that. And then CBN crystallizes. Anything that crystallizes, you can go through work to purify, and you can make really, really pure. Now, go ahead. Yeah. I shouldn't say it won't oxidize. I mean, if you take any of these powders and you leave them exposed to oxygen, they will discolor. They will degrade, but it's very, very, very slowly. So we have CBD isolate that tested at 98% 2 years ago that still tests at 98%. So it does degrade over time. We've noticed that the oxidation will affect the color. So for instance, that ultra pure isolate, if we basically make like a tincture with that, and that's exposed to light, it'll turn like a bright purple, which is, I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Designer tinctures. So Delta 8 is pretty stable. We have to do, on a long enough timeline, I think it does collapse into CBN, probably. Right. So faced with enough pressure, any of the molecules would be unstable. So it's really about how much pressure are you putting on that molecule to change shapes. One of the distinctions between Delta 8 and Delta 9 is because of the bond arrangements on the molecular level, Delta 8 is actually a little bit more stable than Delta 9. But if you put enough pressure on any of those, and the pressure could be as simple as sitting in a room that gets too hot, too humid, not packaging it correctly so it's exposed to excess oxygen, all of that, it's, the same as your Cheetos. They're going to get stale if you leave them sitting in an open bag, and that's because of the effects of the environment acting on that product. So that's going to happen with all the cannabinoids. Because CBN is could be considered one of the final natural degradation products of the cannabinoids. They kind of follow this pathway, and left to age long enough in someone's basement, that's how a lot of people were initially getting CBN, is they were finding old stashes and extracting it. CBN is more stable because of the bond arrangements. There's a way to make atoms happy. They're more comfortable and under less stress, if you want to personify them as such. So CBN is one of the more stable conformations, but faced under stress, you could make changes to it or break it down. Put enough heat and you'll get charcoal. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As far as the usages for CBN, I don't get too much into like the benefit side, mostly because like my world has gotten a little bit smaller. So like my customers like demand, and that, like I'm so busy just trying to like make it and get it and put it in bags, that we don't like. I don't talk to people anymore about like the effects at all. So like people are like, what are, but I know like most of my customers are marketing in like basically sleep products. To help relax. That's kind of generally what people do with the CBN products, and it is becoming a lot more popular than it was before. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, thanks for coming. I really appreciate you guys being here.
Great. Yeah,
All
thank
right.
you.
Thanks.